Good afternoon for Europe. Good morning for the US. Thank you for joining us on this webinar, which we're going to discuss the EU's Critical Raw Materials Act. I'm Bernard Dahdah from Metals and Mining Research within Natixis, and joining me today is Sylvain Eckert, Head of Metals and Mining Industry Banker, and most importantly also an experienced engineer within the mining field. Hello, Sylvain.
Hello, Bernard. Hello, everyone.
I think just before we start deep diving into the into the topic, it's worth contextualizing the EU CRMA. So it comes at a time when mainly two important factors took place over the past 3 years. One is the COVID lockdowns and the global supply chain mess that it created, and the realization by Europe and the rest of the world on how reliant we are on China when it comes to manufacturing, amongst many things. And the fact that when there is a crisis, like a sanitary crisis in that case, some countries can end up hoarding some very important medical supplies. So it's the same idea, I think, of concerns about securing resources, in that case of the EU CRMA, natural resources, so that we don't end up being so needy on some foreign countries. And when it comes to Russia, Ukraine also, that was the clear evidence of how a country could weaponize commodities against another country. In that case, Russia had cut the natural gas supplies. And finally, also, that realization led to the creation of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which was really seen in a not very friendly way by Europe, as the concern was that it's a protectionist measure and that it was attracting what was supposed to be European investment in, say, batteries, and sending them to the US. So this is the context with which Europe published its EU CRMA on the 18th or the 16th of March, just after the IRA. Thierry Breton had said it's the end of finish with the naivety, now starts the action. That's the way he presented this act. And in essence, this act, what it's trying to achieve is the objective is to create a secure and sustainable supply of critical raw materials to enable the energy transition and to enable the digital transition. So if you look at that chart just in front of you, on the right side are the 5 industries which Europe deemed through its Net Zero Industrial Act, which was also published on the 16th, as being strategic industries. So they involve renewables, e-mobility, industry, information and communications technology, and then aerospace and defense. So the way to achieve secure those 5 industries is basically there are 15 technologies that Europe needs to control. So they involve anything from electrolysis to green steel, to batteries, to robotics, data centers. All of those 15 technologies need metals. And on the left-hand side, might not be very clear, but there is a list of 34 critical raw materials that were listed. They're not the same as in 2020. They will change every 4 years, depending on what they see as critical raw materials or strategic raw material. And the differentiation is important here between a strategic raw material and a critical raw material, because in SRM are in blue. They are materials which Europe, through its research, deem as having materials that are projected to face supply risks in the future. And supply risks relating mainly to projected demand, which would be much higher than supply. This is why we have in this version nickel, but 4 years ago there wasn't nickel. So those are the metals we're going to discuss today with Sylvain. I think I'm going to touch lightly on the content of the EU CRMA. It's basically an ambition that's based on 3 pillars. I won't go into too much details, but I'll just mention the most important bits. So, for instance, there's going to be monitoring through the Act. They're going to gather some data on CRMs, the CRM supply chain in Europe, what stocks there are. They're going to ask for some of the large consumers of CRMs and SRMs in Europe to subject themselves to an audit. So the idea is also putting together in a European stand everything they have and knowing what they have in terms of critical raw materials. Some of the financing proposals that have been put in place mainly relate to offtake agreements and facilitating offtake agreements. If it comes to strategic projects abroad, it's going to help them. They're going to try and help them with reducing the risk of investing abroad. There are a lot of bilateral strategic partnerships that they'd like to put forward if Europe isn't able to achieve locally what it can. So some of those projects relate to partnerships, for instance, with Namibia, with Canada, with Ukraine. So there's a whole panoply of measures they've put in place, but we're going to focus on one part, which is the regulation dedicated to the CRMs. So just before, sorry, also there's the standardization, which is going to be very important, which Sylvain will mention. Standardization across the board when it comes to issuing licenses, making sure that it's one-stop shops, that it takes place within 2 years. So it's an acceleration, really putting in place an acceleration of developing critical raw materials in Europe. And on the very left-hand chart, you can see those 4 objectives, which relate to SRMs. So again, it's not all the CRMs that will be impacted. It's basically the SRMs. So they want that at least 10% of annual consumption be mined locally in Europe by 2030, if reserves, if the geology permits. If not, they're suggesting, again, the projects abroad, strategic partnerships and strategic projects. The second bit is at least 15% of SRM consumption comes from recycling. 40% of the consumption of the refining takes place in the EU, and no more than 65% of consumption of each SRM at any relevant stage comes from one country. So now we're going to do an impact assessment, and I'll give much more place for Sylvain to speak. The first part relates to European mining. I mean, Sylvain, how realistic do you think some of those targets are? I mean, is it a paradigm shift in Europe here? Is it groundbreaking, the act, the way you see it from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Bernard. Before going into the details of single commodities and the paradigm shift, maybe you was mentioning a few limitations of the CRMA. The first one is that it's a backward-looking view of the metals market, right? The analysis of the critical raw material and strategic raw materials is being made out of the data from the period 2020 to 2023. I mean, since 2011, the European Commission has published a series of a list of critical raw material, which is updated every 3 years, but it takes the data back from the years before. So 2 things to note is that it's backward looking, so it doesn't necessarily take into account the impact on the recent events such as the Ukraine Russia war, and it doesn't. It's not dynamic. It doesn't take into account that some value chain will experience very exponential growth. The other thing is that one has to differentiate amongst when trying to assess how realistic it is to achieve the goals set out in the CRMA. The various metals are very different when it comes to quantities. You have typically the battery value chain raw materials. They are going to the demand is going to increase very materially over the next decade until 2030, whereas there are a lot of smaller metals small metals or minor metals, let's call it that way, such as, for example, gallium, tantalum, things like that, that are required in much lesser quantity, and which outlook is going to grow, but not at the same pace as lithium, for example, or graphite, which consumption is going to increase 15-fold between 2020 and 2030, or 10-fold between now and 2030. Interestingly, also, when we're talking about processing of these raw materials, the form in which we're going to need, notably those battery raw materials, are nickel and cobalt, is going to be much different from the form in which they were used previously. And precisely, nickel was used in stainless steel primarily, but it's going to be used half and half, roughly, in stainless steel and battery and NMC batteries. It's a paradigm shift for the EU because the European Union was not a mining destination. You could see that from where the capital has been raised historically for mining venture, and it's Canada and Australia, and to some extent the UK as well. So it does recognize that securing supply of raw materials is becoming a strategic issue. Sovereignty and control over the value chain of these raw materials is becoming something that is extremely important. Before diving into the individual metals, maybe one last thing to note is that there will be some hurdles to develop, some generic hurdles to develop a mining industry in Europe, and I'll note as a first hurdle the skill set. Not being mining countries, the European countries not being mining countries, the formation of mining geologists, mining engineers, metallurgical engineers, and all the skill set required to develop a viable mining industry, if it has not entirely disappeared, there certainly will be a shortage of skills when it comes to mining, and the shortage actually is going to be more global.
So if you head into the metals, I mean, we look at Europe, it's not the most lucky in terms of geological resources. You're mentioning that we don't necessarily have the know-how. So if you look at the purple lines here, which are the SRMs, they want to achieve 10%, let's say, in heavy rare earth metals. I mean, we've put here that it's unrealistic. Rare earth metals and titanium, what more can you tell us? Like, why is it complicated to mine as opposed to, let's say, natural graphite or manganese?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, there's the geological potential of Europe, which varies a lot from country to country. And interestingly, is at least there are elements which are not very well known or very straightforward. Like boron, for example, is not something that is well known to be absolutely strategic, but it serves a number of industrial goods, lots of usage, and it's sourced out of mostly two countries, Turkey and the United States. And there has been, since it's been going okay for the past few decades, there has been absolutely no exploration for boron, or no try to develop boron in Europe. It so happens that there is a deposit, lithium deposit, Jadar deposit in Serbia that do contains boron as well, but it's unlikely.
Right?
Yeah, it's quite stuck. It's unlikely to be developed in the short term. When it comes to rare earth element and titanium, very two different tales, right? Rare earth element, well, the rare earth issue is probably was prompted that CRMA or the started the thinking about those critical those critical raw materials back in 2011, when there was the first rare earth crisis, when China reduced their export quotas for rare earths.
Yeah, it was China reduces, sure. So it was 2010, right?
2010, 2011. Since then, some other countries have developed rare earth production capacity. It's still very dominated by China, and China has also expanded their downstream capabilities when it comes to rare earth processing and products. So it's still very much a China story, and it's very unlikely that any rare earth deposits are going to be developed in Europe. There are a couple of deposits that have been identified in Sweden and Finland, but they are 10 to 15 years ago, so unlikely to make the.
In terms of mining, the target is to achieve by 2030.
Yes.
If you started a mine today.
Yeah, it's a very different. We'll come to the processing, but it's a very different story to start a mine and start a processing plant, which is much more easy. And
so a mine is like, I think the average was set 17 years for a copper mine.
Yeah, that was between the discovery and the certain connection. There was some average at 70 years. We can go quicker than that, but bottom line is it takes a long time to get a mine permitted, especially in Europe. A good example is the lithium developments in Europe. If one looks back pre-COVID in 2018, the landscape when it comes to lithium mines development in Europe was pretty much the same as what it is today. There's a couple of projects that have made significant advances. One in Finland. Some other have done some studies, feasibility studies, some test work, etc. But essentially, in 2018, it was assumed that by 2022, 2023, there would be lithium production out of Europe. We're in 2023, and we are saying that by 2024, 2025, there might be some lithium production in Europe. So yeah, it takes a long time.
What was the biggest hurdle?
Well,
is it the
permitting and social acceptance was
okay.
Was the biggest
just
hurdle.
Like the permitting, I guess here the act is suggesting that they'll give the permitting within 2 years if they accept. They get an answer within 2 years.
So defining project of a strategic nature for Europe, the strategic project status hopefully will help to get those projects fast tracked in terms of permitting.
So we'll move on to the refining bit, and in the refining bit, I mean, it seems that we're extremely reliant pretty much on everything, and also it's specifically China, which I'll show the appendix later on. If you had to pick those purple lines, and you would say which ones are very complicated to refine that require heavy skill set, and which ones are the more realistic ones where we can achieve the targets from now in 2030.
Yeah, so it's a very different story among the various elements. Since the question was raised earlier with the session this morning on cobalt, I'll answer directly. So cobalt is an interesting one. You've seen on the previous slide that extraction of cobalt was heavily dependent from abroad, essentially. Pre-Ukraine crisis or pre-Ukraine-Russia war, cobalt was sourced in Russia, Canada, and mostly DRC. But as you can see on that graph, cobalt, most of the cobalt is actually refined in what's sufficient refining capacity of cobalt in Europe today. But that's unlikely to be the case as the automotive industry lifts off. So yeah, to answer quickly your question, Bernard, yes, some metals are much more difficult to process than others for various sort of reasons. The rare earths, well, they're all bundled together for good reasons. That chemically they behave very much the same. Each individual rare earth behave like the next one, so they're difficult to separate. there is an added complexity in that most of rare earth deposits, there's also uranium and thorium that needs to be disposed of properly as radioactive waste, which is not necessarily an easy thing to do. And after that, the other criteria that will make processing difficult will be typically the requirement for high amounts of energy. There was on the previous slide, it was interesting to note, yes, thanks Bernard, that the extraction referred only to titanium metal. So you don't extract titanium metal from the ground, but the focus of the European Union is very much on the titanium, not the one that is used to make paints. There's a major use for titanium. It's a paint pigment. Titanium dioxide, TiO2, is used to make titanium white. You got titanium all over your walls, everywhere. But it so happens that titanium is also an element that's quite key for the defense industry and for the aerospace, right? And making titanium metal out of TiO2 is pretty difficult. And up until recently, most of a majority of the supply, well, not a majority, but give or take 50% of European supply was relying on Ukraine and Russia, which has just vanished. The next best option is it's China, and there's a bit of other substantial production capacity in Japan, etc. But that will be difficult to set up sponge production in Europe.
So technically, producing sponge for titanium is more complex than producing sponge from PGMs.
Well, PGM is an interesting one. It's classified as well as being a process, or EU procures all of its PGM outside of the EU, but they're procuring a lot of it from the UK. So it's a bit of a different situation compared to titanium.
And so, like, if we looked at nickel now, I think we would want to try and focus a little bit on the batteries sector. So you mentioned lithium. I mean, we do have lithium projects in Europe, notably in France. Is that lithium that we have, I understand it's mica, it's different from the lithium we have in South America. Is the processing technically so more complex, more expensive, more energy intensive? Can you tell us more about processing lithium in Europe?
There's two things and two different reasons to try and re-onshore lithium and nickel production. While lithium is used for batteries, as you said, the European lithium industry will need to be developed from different ores. It's not necessarily materially more difficult to extract lithium from the micas, lepidolite, invaldite, etc., but it's never been done, or I shouldn't say it's never been done. The Chinese are currently extracting lithium from lepidolite, and there's sizable lepidolite trade between Africa and China, but the process appears to be quite dirty and inefficient. There seems to have been quite a bit of issue. Now, from what we know, the European project, there's a French lithium project, but it's not the only one. The European project seems to have chosen a different processing route, which is not that different from spodumene, but it's unproven as of today. So there will be a bit of R&D going on to prove up those processes. When it comes to nickel, what's important to consider when re-onshoring nickel production, for lithium as well, but it's particularly evident in nickel, is controlling or making sure that the carbon footprint or the carbon content of the units of lithium that are being produced for the electric vehicles is low enough not to defeat the purpose of electrifying the mobility. If you take the best performing nickel project in the world in terms of carbon footprint compared to the worst, there's probably a factor of 1 to 15 in terms of CO2 emissions per ton of nickel equivalent. The graph we display is just giving broad.
And still, like, there is nickel in Europe. So are we talking about nickel, which is laterite ores, which are more complex and have a heavier footprint to convert into battery grade nickel, or do we have nickel that's nickel sulfate?
Yeah, we have both actually, Bernard.
Okay.
We have laterite, nickel laterites in Greece, and a little bit of production there. But the focus presently is probably in the Nordics, Finland in particular. There's an operation there which has amongst the lowest carbon footprint when it comes to lithium and nickel and cobalt.
And in terms of quantities, are there interesting quantities that we find?
Yes, that's sizable quantities of nickel, not sufficient to address all of the EV market. The European EV market.
I guess it's enough to diversify your sources and not entirely rely on a 100% reliance. And then if you look at the other, I mean, some of the other metals like gallium and tungsten, I mean, some of those metals which we don't hear as much.
Yes.
So are they complicated? I mean, do we need a skill set? Is it a question of time to build the plant, or is it a question of we don't have the skill set and this is going to take years to develop?
So both are different. There's kind of minor metals that I'm referring to. Gallium, for example, is a very tiny market. We're talking 100 tons per year of consumption in Europe. This could be relatively easy to implement. You will just have to plug. You will just have to is a bit, but conceptually you could produce gallium from a bauxite refinery plant. Tungsten is a bit of a different story. Again, there's tungsten production in France, but the steps that you need to be able to use tungsten is transforming it into APT, ammonium paratungsten, and that's driven by China. That's almost not a monopoly, but it's dominated by China, which brings to the question, or to the strategy of development of the value chain, metals various value chain in Europe. If you look at what China achieved, they are controlling the various value chains, not by controlling the resources, albeit you know that Chinese companies have been buying mining companies through the planet, but what they did is secure the midstream, secure the processing of various materials, particularly evident in tungsten, but it's also the case in natural graphite. If you want to put natural graphite in your anode today, you have no other choice by going through China. That is going to change shortly, but it is going to change within time considered, because there are projects, there are live projects for production of refining of natural graphite in Europe and the US, but as of today, you have to rely on China. And what happens is very interesting. The way the value chain started to develop in Europe were not by investing into the mining, which is still lagging, but investing by the end of the value chain. So on the battery value chain, it's particularly evident. There are 30 gigafactories projects in Europe, and they're advancing quite well at a rapid pace. France had no gigafactory whatsoever. In 2025, you could hope that 3 would be on their way, and maybe one or two will have started producing. It's maybe a bit optimistic, but 2030 will get ample capacity in terms of battery assembly and production. But then people start to look into the upstream and building the blocks to integrate the value chain. So securing of cathode active materials, and you start to see cathode active material projects popping up, then precursors, etc., etc., and then refining and processing. And when you put together those elements, sourcing the raw materials, if you have if you're controlling all or a good portion of the value chain, sourcing of the raw material is much more easy from a sovereignty perspective, because you don't need to be autonomous in terms of raw materials. You need to be sovereign, so have ample choice and ample diplomatic relationship with a number of countries in which the resources are located, to not be reliant on one country. But controlling that midstream is very important, as evidenced by China, as evidenced by Europe, by what they are developing. And if you look at other countries that do want to enter those value chain, such as Saudi Arabia, that's what they're doing as well.
I mean, there's the final bit, I guess, of the chain is that mention of 15% scrap of consumption coming from scrap. I mean, unbeknown to a lot of people, is that 55% of our consumption in Europe of copper is already recycled, which is great. And I think that what that chart's showing is basically anything on the right-hand side is secured, it's above the 15%, and we have to work on anything below that 15%. So what is the complexity of developing recycling processes? Are there things, I imagine rare earth elements, I mean, there's an economic aspect to it, I guess, of does it make economic sense or not?
Yeah, there's a couple of things to note on the recycling, Bernard. The first one being that you have to take a dynamic view. So cobalt and nickel today are above the 15%, but as the consumption will take off, and the form of nickel and cobalt will change from ferronickel and or stainless steel alloys or alloys to batteries, so black mass, essentially. You will have to develop new ways of recycling. As far as we understand, as of today, recycled cobalt and nickel from batteries and manganese are not suitable to be input back into the precursor plants. They have to be mixed with fresh material. But there's a lot of R&D going on in that field, and a number of people looking into optimizing it. Lithium is very poorly recycled as of yet. There's big hurdles in recycling the lithium from the batteries, but again, it's so important that
but I guess also the EU is putting it's going to enforce that on
yes,
OEMs, that batteries need to be produced recycled, yes, no matter.
And there are several steps. So I was talking about the refining or the reprocessing, but there needs to be an organized way of recycling those batteries material in particular, to achieve the same level of maturity as other value chains. So you mentioned the copper. You haven't talked about the lead, which is not critical material, but the lead things, a recycling rate of lead, which goes into batteries close to 85%, maybe more. So yeah, it's a matter of maturity. Quickly, you mentioned rare earths.
So see maturity economics also, like we're now incentivized to basically refine whatever we can make that gives us money, like PGMs. Yes, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah,
I guess it costs more to recycle rare earth elements than it is to dig it out.
Yeah, so there's initiatives in the rare earth space. There were some studies that concluded that setting up recycling plant for rare earth was prohibitive from a capital cost and operating cost point of view. So it's going to be interesting to see how that develops. Knowing that in some other value chain, Europe or individual countries took the decision to promote recycling, even if it was not necessarily making economic sense. So I'm not saying that will derive in all value chains, but for very strategic elements, that has happened in the past. The best example is uranium. You may know that a number of countries, and France in particular, did develop the MOX, mixed oxide plutonium uranium fuel, which is more costly to produce than just procuring natural uranium and make new fuel bundles, but has the advantage of reducing the amount of waste that you're generating. So there could be other considerations than just pure economic consideration when it comes to recycling, notably on some very strategic or say annoying materials such as rare earths.
I guess, I mean, that's in terms of concludes the 3 points that the EU is working on towards. And I guess it does look interesting that it's 10% mining, 15% recycling. That makes the EU 25% sourcing locally, which sounds great. As we said, like, I mean, it's somewhat realistic, some of the objectives they're putting, especially that you were mentioning that I guess the biggest hurdle was permitting, which the Act clearly states that steps will be taken. They're also going to develop, revise the resources, invest more into identify the resources, which I also understand is something that maybe over the past few decades in Europe is not something that we particularly paid attention to, given how socially unacceptable it was to mine in Europe. In a way, we exported all the mining that we had and asked other countries to do it, and now there's a realization we could potentially do it more cleanly, in a cleaner manner in Europe, and also achieve sovereignty. Because at the end of the day, I mean, if you look at the question of sovereignty, you look at this chart on the left-hand side, and this is the EU sourcing of CRMs and SRMs from China. And pretty much, you know, the processing stage, as you mentioned, is just massive. We're on at least 15 metals above 80%, 85% reliant on China. And I guess the lesson is the point you were making with China vis-a-vis Japan regarding the island conflict they had, was they stopped the export licenses of rare earth elements. And the lesson there actually was that Japan, which was 95% reliant on China, within probably 5 or 6 years, have become 55% reliant on China. So there are ways to reduce your risk and your exposure. And I think that project, I mean, there's a lot of things they probably won't be able to achieve on site. But if you look at within Europe, but if you look at what happened with the Inflation Reduction Act and the alarm it has stirred, the latest meetings that the Europeans have had with the US, with the EU visiting the US and sitting down with President Biden, is that basically they will work together and try to achieve some sort of an agreement to mutualize the critical raw materials. I think only last week Japan had an announcement with the US that also they've reached an agreement on critical materials. So clearly my take on it is some concluding remarks, and please feel free to publish, ask any questions you might have, is that we're reaching probably a point of a bifurcation in the metals market, similar to what we've seen or are seeing in the oil market. So since the Russia-Ukraine war, with the embargoes on Russian oil, Russia has found in China, India, and Eastern countries a market. I mean, albeit they're selling at a discount, but clearly we're seeing we are seeing a bifurcation in the oil market, and I think potentially over the years we're seeing a metals market bifurcation developing between a Western bloc, you know, EU saying that we achieve strategic partnerships with free trade agreement countries, basically allied countries like Canada, Australia, Chile, South American countries. And so I think that big theme is the bifurcation. I don't know what your take is, Sylvain, from maybe more of a project, someone who works as an industry banker hat rather than your mining engineer hats. But is it something you think this act is enough to boost projects in Europe to develop? Is it attainable? Is it?
Well, it certainly goes into the right direction. It puts the mining or the metals industry take center stage and raise the awareness about the importance of being sovereign when it comes to metals metal supply. There's two things that are extremely important in my opinion. The first one being that the raw materials project will be of a strategic nature for the European Union, and the Commission is stating that. The second thing is that by putting that sector at the center of the agenda, sector being or not the real sector, but the topic of sovereignty when it comes to raw materials. It's mostly metals, but there might be some other key raw materials that there are actually some other key raw materials in the critical raw materials list. It will build some level of social acceptance, which was lacking in countries that were not used to develop extraction or mining projects anymore. So these are the two key advantages of that CIMA. Now, when it comes to how to enforce it and how to get it going, the responsibility will fall onto the individual member states, and the level of readiness of those individual member states is quite different. You mentioned Japan. Japan has been quite advanced with JOGMEC for a number of decades to accompany their industrial companies' needs for materials worldwide. Finland has an initiative which is working pretty well, developing an homegrown mining and battery value chain within Finland. France is setting up a sovereign wealth fund. Actually, it's not the right term, but a fund in which the French state is going to invest to promote the securing of raw materials, pretty much like JOGMEC does, hopefully in the next year or so. Germany is a bit behind, and we have programs from the various export credit agencies to consider as well that do provide support for projects when they are importing materials into Europe. So yes, in conclusion, that's quite a transformational move from Europe that's been in the making for the decade, but which was accelerated by the current condition and the need to build the value chain necessary for the energy transition pretty quickly now.
So we have a question regarding comparing this act with the Inflation Reduction Act, and so if you had to compare it, how would you compare? I think the comparison is not as much of the CRMA with the IRA as much as it is with the Net Zero Industry Act, which came out on the same day as the CRMA. And in a way, the CRMA is this act that helps establish the Net Zero Industry Act. And just a quick note on the Net Zero Industry Act is basically they want to develop those 5-6 technologies in Europe. This is the 88 billion, more like 92 billion is the amount that the Europeans think they need to have a competitive, really competitive, to onshore their production. So like they want to have 100% of electrolyzers production within the EU, 90% of battery cells within the EU, and 92 billion, not the 88, but 92 billion is the total amount that's needed. The 92 billion actually includes training. The 88 billion doesn't include training. So you'll notice that there's this big commotion between Europe. I think was VW mentioning that they were considering moving their planned expansion of battery production to the US because they could benefit from $10 billion worth of incentives over 10 years. The EU's response has been, look, we need 68 billion for the battery cells, and they're probably in that act, they say they're probably going to finance something like 20% of that total of 92 billion. And there is a mention of trying to match what the IRA is offering so that they're able to keep within Europe the production of those gigafactories or others. Now, there are 2 points which I like to make, which I think are interesting. One is in terms of licenses. It does seem that the US's main attraction for some of those investors has been the simplified process of getting the licenses. The NZIA mentions that and wants to accelerate or make it easier, but I think there's some skepticism as around to the ability of achieving that or being as simple as that of the US. The second big point, I guess, is the question of energy and energy security. I mean, generally speaking, energy in the US is much cheaper than in Europe. They've got their own natural gas, they've got their own oil. So this is going to be a big question to those energy intensive businesses is on the long term, can Europe achieve some sort of electricity security or energy security between now and 2030? And I guess one of the points, Sylvain, we discussed in the previous point is like when it comes to low carbon steel and the needs in hydrogen, we are talking about, you know, for France producing 2 million tons, let's say we're talking about a few small nuclear reactors.
The question of electrification of all this value chain we haven't touched upon, but steel is a good example. If you want to greenify steel in Europe, the energy availability or the energy quantum that or the electricity quantum that you need to develop is enormous. We made a quick calculation. If you wanted to switch all of France production to hydrogen-based steel making, you would need another 10 nuclear tranches of 1 gigawatt each, roughly.
There was even 14.
14, yeah.
Well, quite a bit, I guess, to build. But thank you a lot for your time. I mean, we can just leave 1 more minute if anyone else has any questions before we leave you. Alternatively, you can email us if you have any questions. This webinar will be available on the 7th of April publicly on the website in case anyone missed. If you haven't received the publication itself, it will be published again on the 7th of April, freely available on the website, or alternatively, send us a message and we can send you the PDF. Thanks a lot, Sylvain. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you, everyone.
Have a great afternoon. Thank you.